I think those themes are going to sort of continue to inform the papers that we'll hear today and also our discussion after them. We're going to keep to the same format that we followed yesterday, so we'll be hearing from 3 speakers, and in each case we'll have a short time for a few questions directed towards the papers that they're giving after the papers themselves, but we'll also invite them to join us for a panel discussion afterwards, so there will be time for those kind of broader questions that bring together themes across all 3 papers. Just, of course, a little bit of housekeeping. Do please remember to turn your phones off or onto some kind of silent mode so that we're not disturbed by the rough music of ringtones during our conference. For those of you who are so inclined, we would encourage you to live tweet the conference using the hashtag Disgust. Which means, as we found out this morning, that the conference tweets will be kind of intermingled with a whole series of global tweets on the theme of disgust from a number of really very colourful and amusing angles. So we're kind of entering into a much broader debate there through the medium of Twitter, which is really excellent. I would encourage you to have a look. If you don't get reception here, the details of Wi-Fi, username and password guest that you can see on the screen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers for this morning, Dominic Johnson, Ondine Chavoya and Kirsten Fourkert, and we're delighted that the 3 of them are joining us today. Dominic is a senior lecturer in drama at Queen Mary's University of London and author of the magnificent book Glorious Catastrophe, Jack Smith, Performance and Visual Culture, which was published in 2012, editor of the forthcoming Critical Live Art Contemporary Histories of Performance in the UK. Ondine Chavoya is an associate professor of art history and chair of the Latina and Latino studies at Williams College, Massachusetts. He co-curated the exhibition ASCO, Elite of the Obscure, which was really the first museum retrospective to present the work of ASCO and a kind of springboard really for a lot of studies of ASCO and for the exhibition that is upstairs. That exhibition premiered at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in 2011 and went on to be shown at Williams College Museum of Art and at MUAC in Mexico City. And Ondine is co-editor with Rita Gonzalez of its award-winning exhibition catalogue, which you can purchase in the gift shop upstairs. Really an excellent resource. And finally, Kirsten Fourkert, lecturer in media theory at Birmingham City University. As a researcher and activist, Kirsten's work addresses the politics of cultural work and education. Her PhD thesis explores the conditions experienced by freelance artists in London and Berlin and serves as a basis for her first book, Artistic Lives, which came out from Ashgate earlier this year. She's now researching the cultural politics of austerity. So again, we hope this panel will kind of link across art and visual culture, but back into the very kind of immediate political and social realm. Without further ado, then, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dominic, to the stage.
So thank you to Lucy and to Isabel for inviting me. So this keynote, this sort of paper comes from a recent book that I published, which is a book on the work of Ron Athey called Pleading in the Blood, which I did with Ron Athey. And so it takes a part of that and kind of expands it and sort of gears it towards this event. And so I'm going to talk about disgust in 3 ways, which I think are the same ways in which the book also, in a sort of, maybe in a kind of subliminal way, explores the theme of disgust, in terms of, firstly, disgust being something that grounds the aesthetic, and rather than being something opposed to or beyond or outside of our sense of the aesthetic. The experience of disgust being contingent, and thirdly, that embracing disgust allows us perhaps to rethink culture in some ways as not exclusively benevolent in the way it functions, so that culture isn't clearly and solely sort of directed towards a social good. So I'm going to jump in. And just the first bunch of images, which are a bit grainy, they're all video grabs from the existing documentation of the performance that I'll be talking about in the first half or so of the paper. Okay, so in the United States Congress in June and July 1994, Jesse Helms, the late Republican senator for North Carolina, introduced a series of pronouncements and legislative procedures against the artist Ron Athey. In the final years of the culture wars, Helms would use Athey and his work as a scapegoat to police the threat posed by what the religious right deemed to be antagonistic, offensive, or indecent art. And particularly, Helms sought to restrict federal funding for art that involved, quote, mutilation or invasive bodily procedures on human beings dead or alive, or the drawing or letting of blood, end quote. And what this did, like many of Helms's amendments, was attempt to sort of bring obscenity legislation in through the back door after the sort of de-routinization of obscenity legislation in the US. And similarly, things happened akin to that in the UK, which we'll get to later. So Helms's antipathy towards Athey was part of a greater program of assaults on the National Endowment for the Arts, the institution sanctioned to distribute federal funds to cultural organizations and, at that time, to artists. Helms's campaign began in 1989 in response to the work of Robert Mapplethorpe, Andres Serrano, David Wojnarowicz, and other artists. Mr. President, Helms stated in 1994, quote, I have tried without success to establish in my own mind why artists are obsessed with trying to prove that black is white and white is black, and that disgusting, insulting, revolting garbage produced by obviously sick minds is somehow art, and that this art is worthy of being subsidized and rewarded with grants of federal funds, end quote. Between 1989 and 1994, the exemplary targets of Helms's polemic included what he termed, quote, photographs of a naked homosexual with a bullwhip protruding from his rear end, or a naked woman on a stage, her body covered with chocolate, or photographs of mutilated human corpses, or blood-soaked towels dispatched on a pulley over the heads of an unsuspecting audience terrorized by such a surprising development, end quote. Here, Helms caricatures work by Robert Mapplethorpe, Karen Finley, Joel Peter Witkin, and Ron Athey. And he suggests that they epitomize the underside of the aesthetic, the nadir at which point art falls into filth, and where aesthetic appreciation gives way to disgust. Oh, let me just remember, I was going to time myself. So Helms attempted to portray a broad range of difficult or offensive works as unequivocally disgusting. By studying the reception of Ron Athey's seminal performance, Four Scenes in a Harsh Life, of 1994, in Minneapolis and London, I hope to show that disgusted apperceptions of a single work depend on contingencies at the local level. Not wholly, but in great part. These contexts are seemingly beyond the aesthetic domain, yet condition the way a work of art makes meaning, in this case very specifically, I think. In the US, the right's antagonism to Athey was conditioned by anxieties about wounding and homophobia and AIDS panic, and by heightened feelings around the supposed radicality of the NEA, the National Endowment of the Arts. However, at the height of the congressional attacks on Athey in July 94, Four Scenes travelled to the UK, where it triggered different forms of disgusted reception. The British scandal depended not on questions of funding, but on a legal question of condoning or soliciting sadomasochistic acts that instilled revulsion and that were technically illegal. I'll explore the details of these controversies, the differences between these contexts, and their implications for thinking about aesthetics and ugly feelings. And I'll talk about the UK scandal in a little bit less detail, but you'll get the picture. In a monograph on the topic of disgust, Winfried Menninghaus defines disgust as a condition of the production of meaning in philosophy, art, and culture since the 18th century. For Menninghaus, disgust constitutes both the upper and lower limits of aesthetic pleasure. Aesthetic space for Menninghaus is therefore grounded in what he calls an abysmal assumption, an abysmal condition, by which the beautiful tends, in and of itself, to become disgusting. For example, the aesthetic object that commands our attention may become too beautiful, i.e. tend towards rapture, or not be beautiful enough, which tends towards revulsion. And that's only one example. There are many different ways in which the object tends to up to the lower or upper limits of the beautiful. So Athey's work may well invite both extremes. Menninghaus argues, quote, "Disgust not only defines and threatens the aesthetic realm from the outside, but, due to beauty's self-sickening tendency, has always already infiltrated its interior structure." End quote. As such, aesthetic space is a volatile condition whereby the borders of the disgusting surround and condition the locus of pleasure. Menninghaus's theory allows for disgusted apperception as part and parcel of the aesthetic project, rather than the signal of a signal of a project's shortcoming as art. These problems are particularly germane to the work of Ron Athey and to the criticisms posed by his detractors. I will explain how Helms seized upon the perceived opposition between aesthetics and disgust and framed Athey's invocation of ugly feelings to reinvigorate attacks on the NEA. This allowed Helms to deploy four scenes in a series of ideological maneuvers set on decimating the future of publicly funded art in the US, which he mostly achieved. So Athey's notoriety commenced after he presented several sections from Four Scenes in a Harsh Life as part of a festival programmed by John Kilaki of the Walker Art Centre in Minneapolis. The performance took place on the 5th of March 1994, not at the Walker, but in a 100-seat fringe venue called Patrick's Cabaret in South Minneapolis. The extant video documentation, which I've been showing images from, shows a series of performed images, beginning with Divinity Fudge doing a balloon dance, followed by Athey bursting the balloons with a cigar and planting its burning tip into Fudge's buttock. The following vignette, The Human Printing Press, lasts around 4 minutes, and it is this scene that would incur the prolonged wrath of his detractors. Here, Athey made 12 cuts on Fudge's back, using a scalpel, 3 crisp sets of parallel lines and a broad triangle. Each gash reveals a bank of white fat highlighted by shining brown skin. The white pockets slowly brim with blood, which streams down the centre of Fudge's back. Athey works quickly, blotting the wounds with absorbent square towels. Using butterfly clips, his assistants Pigpen and Julie Tolentino attach the prints to taut lines that pass through the audience. After the 10th blotting or so, the prints sharpen, showing a precise impression of the 12 wounds in their geometric formations. Each is a blunt logo of Fudge's mute endurance beneath Athey's scalpel. After a blackout, the performance continues with further scenes that examine Athey's Pentecostal upbringing, his former drug dependency, and his diagnosis with HIV. The performance is couched in the visual language of martyrdom. We see religious stigmata, enactments of the burden of prophecy, the gift of tongues, a surgical crown of thorns. Key images include Athey gouging his scalp with a spinal needle, mopping the rivulets of blood in white sheets, 30 hypodermic needles inserted geometrically up the length of his outstretched arm, and a modern primitives wedding ritual. Quote, "There are so many ways to say hallelujah," Athey preaches from his pulpit in the performance. After an hour, the performance comes to a close. In Minneapolis, there was no commotion, no outrage, just the claps, whoops, and whistles of an appreciative audience. On 24th of March, some 3 weeks after the performance, the Minnesota Star Tribune published a front-page article by local journalist Mary Abb. Sensational reports quickly spread in the syndicated press. Abb did not attend the performance in Minneapolis, but wrote a review in response to a single letter to state health officials. Abb reported that a, quote, "informal complainant expressed a concern that people in the theatre could have contracted the AIDS virus if blood had dripped on them," end quote. Such anxieties would have been misplaced. The towels were securely fastened, and blood could not drip from the highly absorbent fabric. Moreover, the blood was that of Divinity Fudge, who was HIV negative. Ab cited an audience member who alleged falsely that people, quote, knocked over the chairs to get out from under the clotheslines, end quote. The video documentation shows no commotion in this or indeed any other part of the performance. Moreover, in the lengthy post-show discussion, audience members engaged conscientiously with the performance, but did not offer questions or comments about the human printing press. The Walker's director, Kathy Halbreich, described the single complaint as lacking in dignity, and curator John Kilaki noted that it was, quote, extremely homophobic, but also extremely AIDS-phobic, end quote. After the Associated Press picked up Ab's report, reactions were swift. The Christian Action Network and the American Family Association sent out a, quote, declaration of war, end quote, that included a letter template for its members to send to Washington. Pat Robertson, the political broadcaster, attacked Athey on the 700 Club television program and disseminated posters of Athey depicted as the Antichrist. Right-wing activists spray-painted red graffiti on the doors of the Walker and phoned in hate messages and death threats against its curator. In June 1994, these activities brought Athey's performance to the attention of moral crusader Jesse Helms. Speaking of depravity, Helms proclaimed on 25th July 1994, quote, this past March brought reports of yet another NEA-subsidized performance by one of these artists, end quote. Pausing before artists, he lends the word a mocking emphasis. Suggesting Athey as an imposter, Helms underscores this strategy with snide references to Athey's so-called art and his, quote, great moment of artistry in a performance subsidized by the National Endowment for the Arts, end quote. Helms made his presentation to Congress standing beside a life-size black and white portrait of Ron Athey. The image showed Athey as an AIDS-era Saint Sebastian, bound by his hands to a post and covered in rivulets of blood. That is his picture, he said, gesturing to Athey in effigy. Quote, a very handsome man, if you like that kind of man, end quote. The choice of words condenses Athey's multiple depravity as a homosexual, charlatan, and masochist. Helms proceeds with a long description of Athey's performance, including long recitations from an article Athey published in the LA Weekly. Helms continued by introducing his new amendment to prohibit the funding of similar work, which I cited from earlier, and he initiated a series of heated debates about the suitability of Athey's performance for public consumption and, of course, for federal funding. However, Athey was not funded directly by the NEA. He received $150 from the Walker towards travel expenses, which may have been drawn from the centre's annual NEA funding, which amounted to $104,500 in 1993. In fact, Kilaki noted that the $150 Athey received was amply covered by ticket sales, and therefore did not necessarily come from the NEA grant. Regardless, Congress called upon NEA chairperson Jane Alexander to defend her annual budget of $170 million from swinging cuts. Senator Robert Byrd proposed a decidedly disproportionate reduction of 42% in the federal disbursement for theatre and visual arts. The initial proposal was defeated, and after strenuous debate, the NEA's overall budget was reduced by 2%, which amounts to $3.4 million in cash terms. Athey was, of course, a prime candidate for Helms's animosity. The extremity or marginality of his biography, his sexuality, and his aesthetic strategies could easily be caricatured to turn the stomachs of Helms's congressional audience. The art historian Jonathan Katz notes that for Helms, quote, the mere sight of same-sex sexuality was assumed to be sufficiently repugnant to catalyze opposition without need for any rational argument, end quote. Helms also emphasized Athey's use of religious iconography to portray his work as blasphemous or as anti-religious hate speech after the fashion of his earlier tirades against Andres Serrano's Piss Christ of 1987, which he decried in 1989. describing Athey as, quote, immobile while co-performers weave spinal tap needles through the skin of his shaved head and then wind them with wire to create a crown of thorns, end quote, Helms argues something is seriously amiss when such work is rewarded as, quote, the best art America has to offer, end quote, citing the NEA pledge. The primary stimulus for Helms's disgust was Athey's use of wounding as a primary technique for the production of performance images. Mutilation is the pejorative term that circulates in and around the horror Helms and his cronies felt for the spectacles of wounding in 4 scenes. Hence their frequent excitement over the blood-stained towels created in the human printing press. While the congressional fixation depends on congressmen's antipathy to wounding, politicians also mistook the blood prints, I think, for objective manifestations of viral contagion and, in turn, of homosexuality. In the 1980s and 90s, gay men were overdetermined stand-ins for an alarming range of uncontainable threats: perversion, decadence, disease, and death. Athey was particularly vulnerable for marrying the politics of AIDS, queer politics, and art, 3 sources of deep suspicion for the conservative imagination in the period. Particularly, the bloody prints distilled the unmanageable potentialities of AIDS into a fetish. While Athey himself would evade direct punishment, his artifacts could be articulated, demeaned, and controlled by Helms, albeit through fantasy. In the congressional sermons about Athey's transgressions, art is represented as a domain of volatile but transcendent purity that must be defended from the attacks posed perversely by its producers and its celebrants, i.e. artists and critics. Artists are defamed as cunning perverts and wily criminals, intent on upturning social conventions and destroying the age-old sanctity of art. Similarly, critics and historians shore up these perversions in Helms's representations. During the first day of substantial discussion of Athey's work in the Senate, Senator Cliff Stearns articulated its challenges in contrast to humanist platitudes about the transcendental effects of good art. And I quote, "I think what we see here is almost tortured art, and this art is not something we want to endorse. Art should provide us with a whiff of greatness, provide optimism, and instill a feeling of individuality. It should cultivate good taste and elevate the human spirit. It should not turn towards pessimism and negation. The simple question is, does a bloody towel represent the ideals of the American people?" End quote. Stearns charges Athey's work with failing to ennoble its viewer and represents decency and dignity as the central criteria for art and for arts funding. The dismissal and disgust is clearly antithetical to this portrayal. The dismissal of Athey enabled the successful introduction of the Stearns Amendment, which reduced the annual endowment for art by a further 5%, resulting in a total reduction in cash terms of $8.6 million for the fiscal year of 1995, bearing in mind the sort of the original, the money that may have found its way to Athey was $150. So Helms and others made frequent recourse to metaphors for disgust in their many tirades in June and July 1994. In one such presentation, Helms defamed Athey and Joel Peter Witkin, who we saw an image of earlier, describing them as, quote, human cockroaches who have repeatedly bullied their ways into the pocketbooks of American taxpayers, end quote. His cruel-witted characterization of difficult artists as cockroaches was part of a long speech rich in hyperbole, in which he states, quote, "I asked NEA Chairman Jane Alexander if just one cockroach in a pot of soup would be enough, too many, or not enough. One cockroach in one soup is one cockroach too many. I feel the same way about the National Endowment for the Arts," end quote. The repeated reference to cockroaches allowed Helms to retaliate against evidence given in the House of Representatives that only around 10 of 100,000 grants had been questioned in terms of the appropriateness of funding allocations. His cockroach analogy suggests that even a solitary problematic recipient of funding would constitute a scandal. It also foregrounds the spectacle of contagion and corruption as a key image for the threats posed by unwanted artists and, I think, by disposable communities. If a poll could be taken, Helms hypothesized, quote, I suspect that the vast majority of American taxpayers would be totally opposed to subsidizing that figurative human cockroach masquerading as an artist, end quote. Helms would follow up on his harassment of Athey by requesting detailed information from the NEA on 70 grants in July 1994 to sustain his campaign to hobble the NEA. Eventually, in 1996, and so in the book I explain a lot more of these examples of the hyperbole and attacks on different artists, and some of it I find particularly upsetting. And I sort of document the ways in which a lot of this information through reporting found its way to Ron Athey, who was also deeply sort of upset by the experience. Eventually, in 1996, the culture wars would, to some extent, subside as the US found new boogeymen to focus its suspicions upon. However, the long-term ramifications for Athey's career have been debilitating, and he was essentially blacklisted from US major museums and institutions for more or less the last 20 years. And he now lives in London. In 1997, Athey recollected that in the culture wars he had become a pawn for the religious right, as well as for the left. Quote, I became a poster boy for evil on one side, and for freedom of expression and the rights of artists on the other. But these rights had never been offered to me. The money and support had never and would never have been offered to me. And suddenly it was my responsibility to defend it, end quote. So he was invited to speak on chat shows, interviewed in the news, and expected to defend the rights of artists to receive the money that he was never a party to receiving. And he was even tutored by the Walker and by various other institutions to make sure he represented the NEA and different institutions in a light that would facilitate further funding. So the question of the rights of artists was highlighted when Four Scenes was censored at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London in the same month, July 1994. So he'd been booked in the previous, I think, November, and so at the time that the furore was at its height, he was preparing to travel to the UK. So the backdrop to Athey's difficulties at the ICA is a protracted legal battle against practitioners of consensual sadomasochism, which subsequently criminalized Athey's signature use of piercing, cutting, and other body modification techniques. In September 1980, there's a bit of a gear change here, but hopefully it'll make sense. In September 1989, 6 men were charged in the United Kingdom under the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 for carrying out private, consensual, sadomasochistic acts. The charges were the highly publicised culmination of Operation Spanner, a police drive against the production and distribution of hardcore pornography. And these charges were brought after a private videotape documenting the 16 men's SM practices fell into the hands of the police. The trial that ensued, R.V. Brown and others of 1990, was a controversial test case which sought to decide whether or not an individual might legally consent to actual bodily harm, in this case a range of acts including cutting, flogging, branding and genital piercing. The conviction and sentencing of 15 of the men in December 1990 showed that the courts do have a legal power to restrict subjective agency, interfering with the individual's claim to full ownership of one's own body. And I can tell you a lot more about that case if you want to hear the details. I'll tell you a bit about it now anyway, or in a bit. For legal historians Lois Bibbings and Peter Aldridge, the case R.V. Brown and others formalised the uncertain distinctions between the legal, the questionable, and the illegal by simplifying cultural perspectives on acts of public and private wounding. And this precedent would have clear implications for sexual subcultures, as well as, perhaps surprisingly or perhaps not, for art and performance which included wounding. Athey was booked by Lois Keedon to present the full performance of Four Scenes at the ICA as part of a series called Ask the Angels, a festival of work by artists from Los Angeles. In July 1994, Operation Spanner and the concomitant convictions had recently become newsworthy again due to the failure of a protracted appeal to the House of Lords in March 1993. Moreover, the defendants had recently taken their appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. The verdict against the men was upheld when the court finally rejected their appeal in February 1997. Lois Keedon was Director of Live Arts Programming at the ICA. She later recalled, in an interview I did with her, she recalled that the ICA raised concerns about its own potential culpability for soliciting acts that had been recently reaffirmed as criminal in the eyes of the law. And upon consultation, the board of directors refused to host any part of Athey's performance that could provoke media outrage or legal proceedings. And that term soliciting is quite interesting in the context of British sort of backdoor censorship of performance, in that in 1980, the director of Howard Brenton's Romans in Britain at the National Theatre was charged by... a private prosecution was brought by Mary Whitehouse, the sort of British moral crusader, on account against a scene which depicted the rape of a young man the rape of a Druid by a Roman on the stage, and he was prosecuted not for obscenity because the Theatres Act of 1968 abolished state censorship of the theatre, but she brought a prosecution by taking the director to court for soliciting a lewd act in public, thereby using the legislation that prosecuted people having sex in toilets, essentially, and tried to make a case that the effect of seeing the image on stage was equivalent to the effect of seeing an act accidentally in a public toilet or a park. And so the ICA were actually quite right in their concern that a non-sort of theatre-oriented or a law not related to, say, the Obscene Publications Act or the Theatres Act might be used in order to bring a prosecution against the ICA. So I'm very interested about this kind of use of different tactics to sort of when obscenity becomes a much less likely type of prosecution, other laws are sort of deployed or reframed in order to sort of seek legislative address. Where was I? Okay, so in The Guardian, so one of the things that's very interesting is that Ron Athey's treatment in the UK and at the ICA was very well documented. However, it's been completely obliterated from performance history, at least. In The Guardian, journalist Claire Armitstead linked anxieties about Athey's performance to the ICA's fears of legal repercussions. Armitstead highlighted the problems posed by Four Scenes in punishingly terse terms. Quote, whereas self-mutilation is permissible, the involvement of another person is not. She explained that this legal anomaly meant that, quote, British law had forced changes in Athey's act, end quote. As an aside, self-directed acts of self-injury were programmed without concern, including Mehmet Sander's brutal performance, Forced Solos, in which he exerts his body to very, very strenuous experiences, including falling from great heights, running into walls, falling from a headstand naked onto his back. And this was deemed completely not problematic, specifically on account that doing anything to your own body is deemed perfectly legal under the legislation that would have been used to prosecute someone doing an act, however minimal, on another body. So Lois Keedon admitted her frustration, telling Armitstead, quote, the whole Spanner case is to do with definition. What's inflicting pain or pleasure? It's extraordinary that a ruling on sexual practices should dictate what an artist can or cannot do, end quote. To avoid litigation and scandal, Athey was required to find creative solutions to two banned sections, the human printing press, which we've explored in some detail, and a queer wedding ritual in which Athey pierced the cheeks of two members of his company. And this is the sort of uncensored version at PS 122 in New York in November of 1994. Athey chose to show a video of the human printing press in place of the live action, and modified the wedding ritual by having Julie Tolentino and Pigpen pierce themselves on stage, which was deemed permissible under the law. The same demands were made when Four Scenes travelled to Glasgow's Centre for Contemporary Arts in 1995 as part of its Bad Times season. Unlike in the US, Athey's reception in the UK did not rest upon his HIV status or his sexuality per se. The ICA's statements were never explicitly homophobic, and indeed hosted a really informative series of events discussing the legislation and its effects, and brought in people from an organisation called the Spanner Trust, which was a pro-SM lobbying group, which still exists, which were invited to discuss the implications. So the ICA statements were never explicitly homophobic, yet the relevance of Athey's sexuality is ghosted by official statements by the presiding judges in the House of Lords in 1993, the year before Athey travelled to the UK. Controversially, the House of Lords upheld the Spanner convictions on the basis of the homosexuality of the 15 defendants. Lord Lowry stated, quote, "It is not in the public interest that people should try to cause or should cause each other actual bodily harm for no good reason, and it is an assault if actual bodily harm is caused, except for good reason. Sadomasochistic homosexual activity cannot be regarded as conducive to the enhancement or enjoyment of family life, or conducive to the welfare of society," end quote. As in the NEA controversies, the concept of the, quote, social good arises as a strategy to demean practices that were considered marginal, unfamiliar, or distasteful. Social benevolence is constructed here as a foil to that which invokes disgust, namely sadomasochistic activities, albeit in a dungeon or on the stage. An emphasis was placed on the good reason for which wounding is acceptable in order to distinguish between the illegality of the acts under scrutiny in the Spanner trial and properly legal consent to injury by other people. For example, the corporal punishment of children, boxing or rugby, cosmetic surgery, and conventional bodily alteration such as ear piercing. And there's a huge amount of literature on these sort of surprising distinctions, including the surprising inclusion of spanking, in which, interestingly, the person doing the spanking consents on behalf of the child, who has no right to informed consent, which is a very complicated theorizing of what consent consists of. A further adjudicator reinforced this point, stating that, quote, "manly sports and exercises which tend to give strength, activity and skill are not unlawful, and therefore persons playing by consent at cudgels, like hitting each other with sticks, or foils or wrestling are excusable, even if death ensues." And we can talk about that later if you want as well. The ICA's board was prohibitively cautious with regards to Athey's performance in the light of the court's prejudiced perspectives on different uses of injury and its unyielding disapproval of acts of consensual injury in sexualized, i.e. specifically homosexual settings. In the reception of 4 scenes in both the US and the UK, writers would defend the principles of free speech or proclaim the economic self-sufficiency of the arts, but few were outright in their defense of Athey's work. Writing in The Guardian, Homi K. Bhabha was a rare defender of Athey's 4 scenes. And in the US, the sole voice of dissent who defended Athey in terms of his actual work was the civil rights activist and calypso singer Harry Belafonte. And so it's very interesting that it's very specific voices that decide to speak out on behalf of the work and not on behalf of kind of abstract principles. In a searing polemic, Bhabha explained the intense reactions he felt after viewing a recording of the uncensored performance of 4 scenes, arguing that, quote, "the intensity of the work allowed me to empathize with Athey's quest to come to terms with a body and a mind that had been violated by lacerating lovers and unforgiving, oblivion-seeking syringes," end quote. Bhabha critiqued the attempts to suburbanize artistic practice in the US culture wars and in the aftermath of Operation Spanner. He argued that the power enacted against Athey and other artists was part of a deeply troubling campaign that was explicitly anti-intellectual and anti-minorities. Bhabha denounced the suburban culture of paranoia, his term, that criminalizes consent, restricts individual agency, and refuses sexual and racial minorities the dignity of subjective self-determination. At the same time, however, Baba strategically distanced Four Scenes from its local contemporary context by comparing Athey's actions to classical representations in the Western canon. He writes, for example, quote, "Athey's ritual of self-controlled body scarification seemed like a retributive and healing act, and I found myself no more fearful or offended than I am when Oedipus tears out his eyes at the end of Sophocles' Greek tragedy." And similar arguments were actually made in Congress, where sort of more sympathetic senators would say, well, if we criminalize the representation of mutilation or the kind of mutilation of corpses, many of the representations in the state capital, in the what's it called, the state capital, would be criminalized or would not be available for funding, which involved images of flaying or scalping and similar acts, or war imagery. Okay, so to conclude, I have attempted to show that despite Baba's well-intentioned strategy, Athey's work can be studied, and I think should be studied, in the specific local contexts within which it is presented. In the example of Four Scenes in a Harsh Life, the controversies that ensued cannot readily be separated from the aesthetic project of the work. The production of meaning is dependent upon the images produced within the work and the complex network of responses that they procured in both congressional and institutional contexts, as well as in the media. The work undergoes slippages of meaning and signification when it is staged in a new context. Indeed, Athey acknowledges the possibility of semiotic misfire in work that employs live wounding. Of Four Scenes, he would write in 2003, quote, "Can a suicide show with 99 degrees of auto-mutilation shift the public's perception of self-destructive behavior, repackage it into a rite? Or is it just a tiny little fake death full of kinky edge play backed up by an overly didactic message?" End quote. Whether a tiny little fake death, or something more robust, Athey's work commands visceral responses from both his celebrants and his detractors. Defenses of art against the threat of disgusted apperception sometimes draw upon the benevolent cliché that art must be solely a force for social good. Such strategies imply disgust and other negative affects as chalk and cheese to the register of the aesthetic itself. Senator Helms might seem like an easy target on account of his evangelical zeal, hyperbole, and his limited nuance as a critic. Yet the sequestration of ugly feelings from the aesthetic domain is a strategy that runs deep in cultural commentary of many stripes. Jonathan Dollimore has persuasively critiqued the stupefied reverence that naturalizes respectability and wholesomeness as the truth of art. Dollimore suggests that humanistic defenses of art and other well-intentioned lies can be as damaging as explicitly iconoclastic attacks such as those by Helms or his British counterpart, Mary Whitehouse. Don't you love that? Moreover, Dollimore writes, quote, "The active incitement of disgust can be an effective strategy of satirical critique and political opposition, a confronting of culture with its constitutive repressions," end quote. In this spirit, Ron Athey's work suggests that we might search for the bite, the flinch, and the grimace in one's encounter with art and performance. These possibilities and the difficult emotions that accompany them must take their place alongside the consolations that more convivial aesthetic experiences might sometimes offer. Thank you.
Well, I think we have time for a few questions for Dominic, so maybe we'll just open that straight up to the floor.
Thank you very much for that. It was absolutely terrific. And a candidate for this conference would have been degenerate art. And so much of Helms sounds exactly like what was going on in I also feel that Mary Whitehouse is the Immanuel Kant of the 20th century, because she is trying to restore that ban on disgust which Menninghaus is taking up, actually from Kant's critique. And then the third thing I wanted to say is, if you could say just a little more about the human printing press and the actual metaphors of print that are involved, because it also reminded me of one of the great disgust texts of the 20th century, Kafka's in the Penal Colony, where it's a typewriter which prints into the body of the victim who's stretched out, and the notion of the writing machine as the way in which culture operates through bodies to inflict power upon the body. But anyway, thank you for your terrific talk.
Great, thank you very much. That's a fantastic response. So a couple of little things just in response would be that the comparison between Helms and his colleagues and their pronouncements on art and the sort of legacies of the sort of the fascist critique of degenerate art was not lost on commentators at the time. And so there was a who was it? It was I can't remember, the name will come to me. There's he's a theatre director that wrote an article, I think in the New York Times, that is explicitly described, that used actually that or a similar statement that I read out about the kind of that art should have a whiff of greatness, etc. And he places it directly against a statement, I think, by Joseph Goebbels, and it's quite striking. It's really it entails its own kind of hyperbole, a sense, in placing the two together. But that sort of effect was certainly not lost on audiences at the time.
And Stalinist art.
Right.
Stalinist theory as well.
Mm-hmm.
That art must produce the heroes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think for me, there's something quite interesting in terms of, if we're going to talk about disgust, like, I need to know who is being disgusted and what the archive of disgust might be. And for me, what's really interesting is that there's both these examples, or all three examples, it would seem, and therefore kind of renders the subject volatile. And so that for me is very interesting, because it allows us to pull ourselves away a little bit from saying, well, I feel disgusted and you feel disgusted, or you feel disgusted, I think it's wonderful, which I think, there was a discussion yesterday about the affective turn. I suppose there is something questionable about how what is this archive that documents the turns and performances of disgust that we're going to then think through. So that's the first thing. I love the idea of Mary Whitehouse as the sort of the Kant of the 1980s, and I don't really have anything much to say about that other than just to say I agree. But I think in terms of the human printing press, it's very interesting, because for Ron Athey and his collaborators, so I interviewed Divinity Fudge, who was the person who was the kind of the press, I suppose, in the scene, and both of them, Athey and Darrell Carlton, who is Divinity Fudge, said that they thought the problem would be, they were sort of primed for a critique that was going to be a race-based critique. So they thought that the problem would be that it stages this sort of deeply unpalatable image of subjection, of racial subordination, of rejection of the white man overpowering the black man who's sort of positioned beneath him. And that was at different times a problem, a question, but which only really, I think, emerged much, much later, and actually in relation to a set of images that Catherine Opie made of Athey's sort of back catalogue. So they were sort of primed for that, and they didn't imagine that this was going to be a particular problem in terms of different questions, larger questions. But for them, they were thinking, Ron Athey describes it as the kind of the arc of that first part of the show is about labour. So he says that the sort of the trucker guy in a cap sort of assaulting the stripper is a sort of, they were trying to find ways of enacting this sort of image of like male drudgery that then turns sort of nasty somehow, and that that the human printing is some sort of image for industrialization and the sort of the factory floor. So it's the sort of factory floor of his exertions which creates this sort of set of abject images. I mean, I think for me, that's fine, but I think there is a certain kind of I don't know, I suppose incitement of disgust can be an effective strategy of satirical critique and political opposition, a confronting of culture with its constitutive repressions, end quote. In this spirit, Ron Athey's work suggests that we might search for the bite, the flinch, and the grimace in one's encounter with art and performance. These possibilities and the difficult emotions that accompany them must take their place alongside the consolations that more convivial aesthetic experiences might sometimes offer. Thank you.
Well, I think we have time for a few questions for Dominic, so maybe we'll just open that straight up to the floor.
Thank you very much for that. It was absolutely terrific. And a candidate for this conference would have been degenerate art. And so much of Helms sounds exactly like what was going on in Germany in 1937. I also feel that Mary Whitehouse is the Immanuel Kant of the 20th century, because she is trying to restore that ban on disgust which Menninghaus is taking up, actually from Kant's critique. And then the third thing I wanted to say is if you could say just a little more about the human printing press and the actual metaphors of print that are involved, because it also reminded me of one of the great disgust texts of the 20th century, Kafka's in the Penal Colony, where it's a typewriter which prints into the body of the victim who's stretched out, and the notion of the writing machine as the way in which culture operates through bodies to inflict power upon the body. But anyway, thank you for your terrific talk.
Great, thank you very much. That's a fantastic response. So a couple of little things just in response would be that the comparison between Helms and his colleagues and their pronouncements on art and the sort of legacies of the sort of the fascist critique of degenerate art was not lost on commentators at the time. And so there was a who was it? It was I can't remember, the name will come to me. There's he's a theatre director that wrote an article, I think in the New York Times, that is explicitly described, that used actually that or a similar statement that I read out about the kind of that art should have a whiff of greatness, etc. And he places it directly against a statement, I think, by Joseph Goebbels, and it's quite striking. It's really it entails its own kind of hyperbole, a sense, in placing the two together. But that sort of effect was certainly not lost on audiences at the time.
And Stalinist art.
Right.
Stalinist theory as well.
Mm-hmm.
Art must produce the hero.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think for me, there's something quite interesting in terms of if we're going to talk about disgust. Like, I need to know who is being disgusted and what the archive of disgust might be. And for me, what's really interesting is that there's both these examples, or all three examples, have a very extensive archive of the documentation of people's feelings of sort of deep revulsion against an image, a set of images, a set of practices, and so on. Because it essentially brings the whole of art into disrepute, it would seem, and therefore kind of renders the subject volatile, And so that for me is very interesting because it allows us to pull ourselves away a little bit from saying, well, I feel disgusted and you feel disgusted, or you feel disgusted, I think it's wonderful, which I think, there was a discussion yesterday about the affective turn. I suppose there is something questionable about how what is this archive that documents the turns and performances of disgust that we're going to then think through. So that's the first thing. I love the idea of Mary Whitehouse as the sort of the Kant of the 1980s, and I don't really have anything much to say about that other than just to say I agree. But I think in terms of the human printing press, it's very interesting because for Ron Athey and his collaborators, so I interviewed Divinity Fudge, who was the person who was the kind of the press, I suppose, in the scene, and both of them, Athey and Daryl Carlton, who is Divinity Fudge, said that they thought the problem would be they were sort of primed for a critique that was going to be a race-based critique. So they thought that the problem would be that it stages this sort of deeply unpalatable image of subjection, of racial subordination, of rejection of the white man overpowering the black man who's sort of positioned beneath him. And that was at different times a problem, a question, but which only really, I think, emerged much, much later, and actually in relation to a set of images that Catherine Opie made of Athey's sort of back catalogue. So they were sort of primed for that, and they didn't imagine that this was going to be a particular problem in terms of different questions, larger questions. But for them, they were thinking, Ron Athey describes it as the arc of that first part of the show is about labour. So he says that, the sort of the trucker guy in a cap sort of assaulting the stripper is a sort of, they were trying to find ways of enacting this sort of image of like male drudgery that then turns sort of nasty somehow. And that the human printing is some sort of image for industrialization and the sort of the factory floor. So it's the sort of factory floor of his exertions which creates this sort of set of abject images. I mean, I think for me, that's fine, but I think there is a certain kind of I don't know. I suppose I don't want to call. There's a sort of a sense in which maybe those images or those readings don't always sort of hold. Partly in the face of the images and the kind of events that follow in the same performance. So I suppose for me, I'm not sure how how to do something with those images or make something of them because the images that follow and the kind of the overall responses were so sort of formidable. But yeah, that's all I really have to say about that. Thank you there.
I can't remember the guy's name, but I know you'll know him. I was just wondering why the guy who does the bloodletting, he's with the Live Art Development Agency.
Franco B.
Yeah, why is he more acceptable in a sense than Ron Athey? I don't know, he seems like he's more, what's the word, in popular consumption, in the UK. Do you know what I mean? And Ron Athey still seems to be sort of subcultural to Franco B somehow. I don't know. Or is that not true?
I don't know. I suppose I'd want to know how we'd measure that, but I think I don't know, to be honest. I don't know if that's the case. I think if we look for sort of specific markers of both their marginality and their kind of assimilation into the major institutions, they're on an equal footing. I think there's something particularly unsettling about Franco B's work in a different way to Ron Athey's work, even though they both rely on, or they both, at least Franco B used to, they both rely on the use of and the sort of the kind of the use of blood as a material. But for example, Ron Athey was at the Tate a few weeks ago we presented his book and did a series of his screenings. Franco B performed there in 2003. I don't know. We can find examples that try and. So I'm not sure. I'm a bit. So I suppose I'm a bit uncomfortable with trying to sort of measure, or sort of as though there's a kind of algebra of marginality or something. I don't know. I think it's a very complicated question, But there would be ways, there would be ways in which their work is received differently, because Franco B presents himself as a painter who makes performances, and the work is very much contextualized in the way he speaks about it in relation to that concept. Therefore, he's more assimilable to mainstream institutions of visual culture and visual art, whereas Ron Athey describes himself as sort of showbizified, that he uses theatricality very, very explicitly, camp, characterization, persona, music, lights, glitter, smoke machines, so that makes him a little bit less easy to assimilate into the sort of the canon of visual culture, if that's what one would want to do. Interestingly, though, Franco B is probably the first person to make a high-profile response to a spanner in 1990. I've written a chapter on the sort of the reception of spanner that's in this book. I can tell you about it if you want to know. But he was making works which explicitly responded by stitching his lips together in 1990, creating images where he had images and words and slogans carved into his back with a scalpel and documented, and so on. So there would be a whole different story which we could tell about the impact of spanner, in the same way perhaps, or in an equivalent way to which Ron Athey's treatment in the NEA is part of a much larger sort of spectrum of problematic receptions and reframings of work. The reason I find Athey's work interesting in and of itself, but also for me it's quite interesting because he sort of, even though he was a major target in the NEA debates and the culture wars, he often falls outside of the kind of the key narrations of that period, because he is the sort of the last great target of conservative enmity. So that's a rambling response. But.
I mean, thanks for that, because it was really brilliant. Now, I think that question about the contingency of different international audiences is really important. And I just kind of wondered on that tip about the religious element of this, which you seem to have sort of skirted around a little bit. The work is very clearly based around kind of religious rituals. The imagery is kind of blasphemous in a sense. And that aspect of it, which is one of the other, you kind of said that the three conflicting things were AIDS, queer kind of political activism and art, but this kind of religious aspect is obviously massively overdetermined in an American context in a way that it kind of isn't here in the UK. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that religious aspect, and I'm kind of interested in why that's something that sort of, that it felt to me just a little you were kind of skirting around in the reception.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think from reading all of the congressional record of Helms and his contemporaries in their response, it is marginalised. And I think the reason is not because it's marginalised in the work, because it's absolutely central to the work. I think Helms probably learnt a lesson through his treatment of Serrano and other people, Joseph D'Amato and other people, that basically it was a very complicated approach to take. And so I think he seized upon images in which he could more, I don't want to speak for him obviously, but I imagine, it feels from reading it that maybe he was seeking a more dependable image of revulsion, and Athey fit the bill. Similarly to the previous people who were sort of attacked by Helms were the NEA4, Karen Finley, John Fleck, Holly Hughes and Tim Miller, all of whom it was specifically sort of sexual wantonness or something that was the problem image. I think there was a strategic moving away, although at the same time he was the Antichrist in like a poster campaign in the southern states. Athey was. So yeah, I probably do skirt it. I mean, I guess in a way, like one of the sort of not very good responses would be that this is taken from the book, and the book very extensively documents the sort of the challenges, and also I think maybe another reason I possibly skirt it is I just really don't. I think for a person from England, it's just very hard to understand the level of tension in the US that circulates, or that is founded upon religion. And so in the book, it's an edited collection, and many other people, including people from the US, and including Athey himself, who's a fantastic writer about his religious upbringing and his sort of refusal, his turning away from Pentecostal Christianity or Pentecostalism, that's sort of well trodden in the book. But I agree. Realistically, it should be the four key things. But it is interestingly underplayed. I think also because very early in the debates, Helms says something like, a Democrat responding to him says, aren't you? So he says something like, basically, what your argument, the new amendment, which bans the representation of mutilation and of the drawing of blood, etc. He says, aren't you criminalizing or preventing the funding of Christian art? That an image of the crucifixion would now therefore not be permissible. And Helms does this great sleight of hand where he says, if this amendment could prevent the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ, then I think perfectly yes, we should bring it into play, which is preposterous, but it's a great sleight of hand. So I think he's actually, I call him not a very nuanced art critic, but he's a particularly nuanced sort of rhetoric.
Well, I think maybe we'll kind of leave it there and maybe ask those of you with